Prepare to die.
So this is a blast from the past. Barbarian, also known as Death Sword, depending where and when you got a copy of the game, and this is Barbarian as I knew it on the Amiga 500. So, here's what it's all about. The evil sorcerer Drax has enslaved Princess Mariana. The people of the Jeweled City are on the brink of unspeakable doom. Their only hope is the mysterious barbarian from the northern wastelands. Are his warrior skills good enough to defeat the forces of darkness? Only you can say. This is the write-up on the back of the box of Barbarian for the Amiga, and is one of the most famous and controversial of the early fighting game genre.
Prepare to die.
Barbarian on the Amiga was probably the very first fighting game I ever played. I'll be honest though, it wasn't until I decided to dive back into it recently that I ever won a fight on the game. In the game, you play as a barbarian who has to fight a series of one-on-one battles with other barbarians as you aim to rescue the princess. The game was really controversial for the image used to advertise the game on the box art and in magazines. Instead of using drawn artwork, they hired the guy who was Wolf in the British version of Gladiators and a page 3 model to stand mostly naked. Now, truthfully, there's nothing too shocking about the way they're dressed in the modern eye, but even back then, this was in line with the movie Conan the Barbarian, so I think it was a lot of fuss over nothing. But I have to remember that this came at a time in an era where adults still thought that video games as a concept only existed to brainwash children, drive them to violence, and corrupt their morals. So it's no wonder that it was seen as controversial. The controversy, though, only helped lead the game to some success. As a marketing campaign, it meant that everyone was talking about it. So having rediscovered it recently, it's easy enough to get into, but at times can be a bit frustrating to play. It can be quite unforgiving for new players as you get relentlessly attacked on the very first stage. When I was a kid and I played it, I literally, and I mean literally, never won a fight and was pleased to get any offense moves in at all. Now, being an older and wiser gamer, in my recent playthrough I learned that it's not all about going in all guns blazing, or should that be all swords blazing. Fight smart, not hard, as they say. If you back up to give yourself some space and then go in with a low kick, or do a forward roll to sweep your opponent off his feet, then you'll have a shot at unleashing a devastating sword, and that way you will have a chance at decapitating your opponent. Yes, that's right, long before Mortal Kombat gave the fatalities, you could hack your enemies apart in this one-on-one fighter. The controls are simple enough. You just have one fire button to use, as was typical with Amiga games, and then a combination of pressing fire and a direction will pull off different attacks. Sometimes the swords will clang against each other, and you'll find you can swing your sword high and low, and mostly you'll be going for that one-strike decapitation kill. Of course, the same can happen to you, which can be frustrating, but this is literally 7 fights to the final boss, so it shouldn't take you forever to beat the game, even if you have to restart it a few times. Or unless you're like me, where it took you some 30 odd years to come back to it and actually get good. Now, the graphics are a bit poor for what the Amiga was capable of, but the animation was still fairly realistic. Overall, not bad for the age of the game, but whilst it has realistic style design and animation, the Amiga was truthfully capable of better than this. Today we are looking at the Amiga 500 version, of course, but it was also available on other platforms like the Atari ST and Commodore 64. The stages you fight in are just single frames, without scrolling, and although very simple, I felt a real nostalgia to see the woodland scene where the game begins. It was like returning to a place I hadn't seen since I was a child, and it's just as I remember. I think one thing everyone remembers from this game is the little green goblin troll man that will come along and drag away any of the bodies of the losers at the end of the fight. This is something I'd love to see brought back in a remake or just in any fighting game really. It's also got humour in it that if you have sliced off the head of your opponent in the heat of battle, the green little troll creature will kick the head off the screen. Now the game doesn't have an energy meter quite like you'd find in other fighting games in more recent times, but instead you have a bunch of circles that start to deplete as you take damage. The final boss is something of a disappointment, as he will just stand there and shoot magic energy balls at you, and the challenge here is simply about dodging them and going either high or low not to get struck. He doesn't whip out any skeletal-like weapons to make this even more of a He-Man and the Masters of the Universe kind of fight experience. I will give you a warning that the final boss can one-hit kill you. And to be honest, this kind of sucks. It's simply a design choice that was seen as okay back then in this era, but having to restart the whole game from the final boss just because you didn't know that he could one-hit kill you feels a bit unfair. Now, there was a sequel to this game which I may check out in another video for another day, and I have just discovered that there was a modern reimagining about 10 years ago, but I'm not sure if it's still available. Would seem it was on iOS, and perhaps just before they changed the compatibility with a ton of old apps that still can't find their way to be played on modern iPhones. Now, with all of the fighting games I've covered on the channel recently, it's been really interesting to play Barbarian, or Death Sword as it's also known, as it's a super early example of the genre. But all of the pieces are here. I remember being so impressed that Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance introduced swordplay, and of course there was Soul Calibur and Soul Blade and Soul Edge. Not sure which one came first of those last two, but they were fighting games that concentrated on sword fights, but Barbarian had done that at least 10 years earlier. Now, this won't be a game that you're going to pour hours and hours into these days, but it's been fun to return to an era of games that was simpler and at times presenting a different challenge to what you get nowadays. Whilst everything these days is fairer and more balanced, this was a game that threw you into the deep end and you either sunk or swum. Now, I'm pleased to say that now I'm older and have returned to the game, I'm able to swim in the game and even beat it. But even though I always lost when I was younger, I was always impressed by that gritty 1980s Arnold Schwarzenegger style of big meaty man combat. So that's going to wrap this up for this review and look back at Barbarian, also known as Death Sword. Did you play this game when you were younger, or do you still play it now? Let me know your thoughts and memories of this game in the comments, and we'll chat. Now, if you haven't done so already, I would appreciate if you would smash that subscribe button here on the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel, and of course check out www.xstreamed.tv/gaming for the written article version of today's discussion. And with that, until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom, and we're off the air.